Welcome everybody to Friday Forums. This is a reoccurring series we're hoping to do each Friday where we bring a different project or community initiative happening around Indianapolis and highlight that, all as part of Plan 2020. We're hoping to stitch together all these different initiatives into one comprehensive plan. So this week we're lucky enough to be joined by Katy Brett, who's the Executive Director of Renew Indianapolis, and she'll be presenting on that subject area. Katy?
Thank you. Thanks, Alex. Glad to be here. As Alex said, I'm the Executive Director of Renew Indianapolis, which is a community land bank. We set out with a mission to transform vacant and abandoned properties into productive good use. There's an example here on the screen that I pulled these pictures from a previous job I had on the east side. We just launched earlier this year, but hopefully we'll have some of our own stories like this to tell very soon. When we talk about vacant and abandoned property in Indianapolis, I think that people think of it in a variety of ways. There's chronically vacant properties, which are not necessarily abandoned properties. Abandoned properties, which we define as those that have stopped paying property taxes. Tax sale properties, properties of a variety of conditions that are eligible for the annual tax sale because they've been delinquent in paying taxes. County surplus properties, which are properties that have gone through tax sales, unsold and unredeemed, and they kind of sit in a limbo state while the county has the authority to sell those in a surplus sale. Sheriff's sale, which is another sale entirely, which is a process that the sheriff conducts as part of a foreclosure proceeding. Bank REO properties, these are properties typically that banks have taken into their inventory after a foreclosure. Not technically abandoned, they're often paying the taxes and providing some level of maintenance, but are considered part of the overall problem of vacant and abandoned properties. Bank walkaways, where banks may have initiated foreclosure proceedings and have stopped for some reason or another, and so those properties will probably eventually end up in tax sale and maybe eventually county surplus, but before they get there, they're in a bit of a walkaway state. And then brownfields. A lot of folks throw these properties into this category because they're often abandoned in terms of no one's paying taxes and they're sitting overgrown, often obviously commercial or industrial properties that are part of that. So as you can see, it's kind of a complex topic and a lot of different words for something that we all probably use abandoned property to define, but they all have different processes and different ways of getting reuse out of them. Our tax foreclosure procedure, which is what I'm going to focus on for most of my presentation, because these are properties that the city and county have the ability to have some sort of ownership in. And so while the other properties that I defined earlier may eventually end up in this process, these are ones that the county and city have the ability to do something with immediately. The primary purpose of the tax sale, which as I said is offered every year and is authorized by state law, is to recoup the anticipated tax revenue that's unpaid due to delinquency. So they set the minimum bid of tax sale proceedings pretty high because it incorporates all unpaid taxes and other city liens that have gone unpaid on a property. And the purpose of that is to bring in revenue for the county. If, as I said, properties go unsold and unredeemed, those properties become known as surplus property, where this county has a lien on the property and can sell it through a surplus sale, and they do that 3 or 4 times a year. And again, they set a minimum bid way below what the tax revenue would have been, but the purpose is to sell these distressed assets and bring in as much money as they can to distribute to the taxing entities. And depending on what's going on in the economy and the access to capital that different folks have, these sales can bring in several $1 million. Or during some of the low periods of the last few years, they didn't, and I think now they're up to bringing in a few $1 million each. But again, the purpose of that is to bring in money for the county. It's not necessarily focused on the reuse of the property. The purpose of Renew Indianapolis and our work with DMD and their land bank inventory is to see successful redevelopment of problem properties. So we try to do that in a way that's setting the acquisition price fairly low. Obviously, we need to have funds to operate and to cover some of the basic costs that are involved, so we can't always give these properties away. But we set that value fairly low in the hopes that more money will go into the redevelopment of a property. The ability to have a land bank was authorized in 2006, and legislation passed at that time that did three things. Allowed the city to increase the carrying cost of those vacant and abandoned buildings for negligent owners, so making negligent owners more accountable and increase cost. Approving the efficiency of the tax sale process, which we're kind of used to at this point, but there were times in not so recent past where there were 3 different sales and properties had to go through several years of sales or being eligible for a sale before the county was able to take ownership. And then 3, expanding the range of property redevelopment options, which is through a land bank. Just to clarify some terms too as we talk about this, lots of different people are involved in land banking. Developers, investors, real estate investors, speculators. Often folks will aggregate parcels of land to bank and hold for development purposes. But when we talk about a land bank, we're talking about usually a municipal agency, or in the case of Renew Indianapolis, a nonprofit entity, or in some areas of the different states have quasi-governmental entities that their goal is to strategically assemble properties to reduce blight and get them back into good hands. So I'm just going to show some maps now. Hopefully you can see. These maps are not exactly up to date, but they're showing you an overall picture of what's happening in Marion County. These are surplus properties. As I said, these are properties that have gone unsold and unredeemed. The number of this varies throughout the year, but it hovers around 5,000, give or take, depending on the time of year and whether a sale has recently been held. Here's a map showing high weeds and grass from last summer, and you can see that those maps generally model each other, but that there's obviously a lot higher high weeds and grass cases. We use this as an indicator of abandonment. As properties go toward abandonment, obviously they're going to have no one taking care of them, and you're going to have more high weeds and grass filings, though high weeds and grass in itself is obviously not the only indicator of abandonment. And then this is maybe a little hard to see, but this is what we use as kind of an indicator of where abandonment might be soon to occur. So we look at properties that are both tax delinquent and have an open unsafe building code violation. And those properties, you can see, generally mirror some of the other maps, but they start to spread out a little bit into outlying areas. And this is a key piece of strategy. Obviously, you could start by focusing where there are large clusters of properties available and try to make a big impact, and that's one strategy that we deploy. But you could also look at where 1 or 2 properties are threatening the stability of a neighborhood because of their potential abandonment, and then trying to target those to stabilize an area before it gets to a place where there are multiple properties. DMD's inventory, again, this is a little outdated because we are now selling properties, but this shows where DMD has assembled property into their land bank. Again, this is a small subset. At the height, the land bank inventory was about 1,200 properties in the midst of several thousand that are available in the county. Right now, we have just under 800 properties that we're actively trying to market. And you can see that these are clustered in areas, usually where there's a housing TIF or a TIF, or this DMD has made investments in neighborhoods through their HUD allocation. They assembled properties close to those allocations to try to provide some site control and stability so that that work and investment can be furthered. Why Renew Indianapolis? As I said, we're a nonprofit entity. We are not part of city government, though we work closely with all types of government. The reason that we exist, as I said, is to return vacant and abandoned properties to good use. And hopefully we're able to do that in a way that's a little bit more nimble and a little bit more flexible than governmental agencies can. There are declining resources available to the city, and cities often have to be very complicated in the way that they do things for good reason. But national trends are showing that a quasi-governmental or a nonprofit entity that's able to look at abandoned properties and respond easier to opportunities and focus on buyers and getting them into good hands is a better way of doing vacant property disposition. Over the last year, we've worked closely with DMD to focus on their existing inventory, to create a streamlined process to access those properties, to provide a transparency on who's accessing properties and for what purpose, and to provide some opportunity for neighborhood input and ongoing accountability once a property is sold. These are 4 areas that we really saw when we looked at land banking in Indianapolis, what had been lacking over the last couple years, and decided that we really wanted to create something that was accessible, transparent, accountable, and provided for neighborhood input. We're doing that through a variety of ways. Transparency, I'll start with. We have all properties that are available are listed on our website at renewindianapolis.org. You can see the status of those properties. Once the property is sold, every person who purchases through us in the city has to sign a project agreement, and that project agreement gets recorded and holds them accountable for doing what they said they were going to do. We've increased the capacity, our staff as well as at DMD, and including other folks from other city agencies as part of those transactions to both provide transparency and some increased capacity, and tied to neighborhood redevelopment strategies, preferably neighborhood input. This is something that's required by ordinance, and we notify every neighborhood where a property is located and that CDC about a potential transaction so they can provide input should they want to. Right now we have several ways to access properties. The first is through a rolling application. This is an open application process. Anyone can apply for no limit of properties, and as part of that application we just require 3 threshold pieces of information before we'll process it. And those are a scope of work and a list of improvements to be made to a property, proof of financing and funds available to complete that work, and then the neighborhood notification piece that I mentioned earlier. This process we launched in January, and we've been selling properties since then, and we've pretty much worked out most of the kinks, and it's gotten to a pretty efficient process at this point. I think we've sold just over 50 properties and had applications started on about 180 properties. And so we're well on the way to selling properties in this more transparent and accountable process. And I'll tell you in a minute about how we've recently launched some additional programs to hopefully sell additional properties. This process is, like I said, rolling. If we receive this information by the 3rd Friday of the month, it will be reviewed at that month's meeting and start the process of approvals. And if not, then we wait till the next month. I should say if we receive 2 applications or more for the same property, we've outlined a list of priorities for the nature of the buyer and the nature of the use. Those are also available on our website, and that's the document that we default to if we have applications that are otherwise the same. We've laid out what we prefer in terms of buyers and use. We've also said that we'll do a more passive approach, as I outlined earlier, but we'll also do a more active approach. And we've just launched our first RFP. We released that almost 2 weeks ago now, and we had a workshop earlier this week for potential responders. In this RFP, we worked with the county, and so this RFP covers both DMD-owned properties and county-owned surplus properties in a targeted area. This RFP is focused on the northwest area of Center Township, often called Riverside or Unwa, surrounding Harding, basically from Harding to MLK, from 25th to 30th. Buyers, we asked them to provide information about their plan and their submission. We've asked that they apply for no less than 5 properties in defined areas to hopefully maximize impact and jumpstart the market in this way. And as part of this process, the city's offering some incentives, including home funds. We have about $400,000 in home funds available to assist developers. We've offered folks the availability to say how they would use TIF funds in this area, how they would use hardest hit funds, which are for demolition, that I'll talk about in a minute, as well as permitting and zoning fee assistance. They can suggest all of those things, and we'll consider it as part of their response. We hope that this process will provide folks the ability to know that they're going to have control over a group of properties in an area, and that gives them some protection for their investment, as well as I said, making impact in those areas. There's a map showing the current RFP properties that are available. And you can see if you take a look at this, it's also available on our website. There are some blocks where you can have 7, 8 contiguous properties, and if you include the properties behind and across, you could get close to 20 properties in just a block area where you could really make an impact. As I said, we've launched this process and said, come to us with your applications and your ideas. But we also realize that most properties that are in this condition are in areas where it's difficult to make budgets and numbers work. And so we know that there are additional tools needed for redevelopment. And a lot of those come through DMD, and others come from relationships with private lenders, INHP, and others. And we're actively working to partner with those organizations to create loan products that would be beneficial to folks who are looking to redevelop these properties. Clean title is another key piece of land banking. Many of the properties that we offer right now do have clean title. Some of them have city liens expunged, but others are still on there and need to be cleaned up. And so as an ongoing effort, we know that cleaning up the title is a key piece to marketing these properties. Aside from that work to sell the properties that are in DMD's inventory already, we've looked and worked with DMD to be the administrator of hardest hit funds, where we will strategically demolish properties that have been deemed not possible for rehab, and in areas where redevelopment might be very hard, but where there are uses defined. So all of the properties included in the application had to have an end use defined, as well as each building had to be scored against a matrix to make sure that it was one that was really worthy of demolition. We suspect that even at that, we'll have some properties come on and off this list, and I encourage folks to go to the website and find that list of properties, and if there's one that you think does not need to be demolished, to let us know. Likewise, if there are properties that you might like to see demolished that are either surplus or land bank properties, our work is pretty much defined to those groups for this particular pot of money, to let us know. But again, we think that strategic demolition is an important part of redevelopment to eliminate blight and properties that really have lost the ability to be rehabbed in order to jumpstart and give people a clean slate, or aggregate those properties to a redevelopment use that may be different from what it was before. We've also just recently launched a side lot program where certain properties in the DMD inventory are being offered as side lots. This was launched just earlier this month in July. Lots that are available are not within a quarter mile of a new construction permit in the last 2 years and are not in one of our targeted RFP areas. So not all lots are eligible, but for ones that do not fall within those categories, they are eligible for purchase to adjacent property owners who have a valid homestead deduction, and those are offered at $750. Going forward, we really think that land banking can be a powerful tool for redevelopment in Marion County. Assembling properties and really viewing them as an asset that can be leveraged as opposed to perpetual blight is something that I think we have to do if we're really going to change the direction of neighborhoods, particularly in our urban core. And knowing the market and building off of it to achieve both city and neighborhood plans. Land banking can be a powerful tool. You can have all the plans in the world, but if you don't own the real estate, it's very often hard to enact those plans. And so having an entity, I hope like ours, that can assemble those properties and be part of that redevelopment plan is essential. Hopefully, we've proven that we're responsive and open to talking to folks and answering questions. So if anyone has questions or wants us to come and meet, present at a meeting, meet with groups of buyers who might be interested, we're always happy to do that. And you can just contact us through the website. As I said, renewindianapolis.org is where you can find all this information. And hopefully it's done in a way that is clear and transparent, but we're also open to feedback. So if there are things that are not working or you find cumbersome, let us know and we'll do our best to adapt. If there's anyone here that has any questions, I'm willing and able to take them. Yes, Alex.
You showed a couple of maps like highways and liquid properties, they kind of forecast where vacant properties might exist. Is there anything that you guys can do to proactively kind of stop that? I mean, what options do we have before they get to this phase?
Yeah. So for properties that we kind of use as a forecaster for abandonment, a tax delinquent, and an open unsafe building code violation. If it has an unsafe building code violation, it means it's vacant. If the property is occupied, there's all sorts of entities and strategies to try to get folks assistance that they need so that they don't end up in foreclosure. But if a property is vacant and on its way to being delinquent, the city has various tools they can use to try to issue penalties or blight penalties against those properties to hopefully get them into our hands faster to get them back out into good hands. There's little we can do to prevent abandonment at this point because often it's difficult to find those owners. They're just unresponsive. Any other questions? Yes.
So we talked about the unwanted neighborhood. Are there other areas in Indianapolis that kind of have that concentrated abandonment issue that would be eligible for like the RFP process you mentioned?
Yes, we're planning to do one more RFP later this year. I'm not yet saying where that will be, though some folks in that neighborhood know. But if you can look at this map where you can see DMD's existing inventory, you might be able to guess. And we're looking at where those properties are concentrated. Oftentimes, the surplus properties are concentrated in those same areas, and so we would be looking at those places.
When you do the RFP, is the desired use to preserve a residential neighborhood, or do you look at changing use?
Yeah, it depends on the area, obviously. There are some areas where, for example, in our existing RFP, it might be compelling if there are areas around the canal or MLK itself or Birdsell Parkway that it might make sense for use to change a little. But for the most part, we're looking at applications to keep the use the same, but increase the density often by filling in those vacant lots and gaps. So probably keeping the density where it was and perhaps increasing it a bit.
Is a priority given to submissions from local groups or individuals, or would you accept bids from anyone?
Yeah, we'll accept from anywhere, but obviously neighborhood input is a big piece. And if there's an entity that's known in a neighborhood and has been successful, then I would suspect positive feedback that would make that application stand out.
How do you get that neighborhood feedback part of the process?
It's part of the RFP process, or
In terms of actually going out, and when you say you're taking neighborhood feedback into consideration.
so for an application to be processed, a neighborhood association and community development corporation where those properties are located are notified and their input is actively solicited. For our RFP process, we've met with the neighborhoods in that area, and 3 neighborhood representatives serve on the review committee so that their input is as a part of that decision. Anyone else? Thanks for the opportunity to present. Let us know if you have any questions. RenewIndianapolis.org.